Hi, I'm a higher ed CMO and I have a confession to make. Whenever somebody calls me a millennial, I correct them immediately. Excuse me, I am Gen X, and I don't just correct them, I secretly feel a little proud of it. Part of it is because I have a bit of a protectiveness around Gen X. And if I'm being completely honest, I have a whole set of assumptions attached to that correction. I think being Gen X speaks to something about how I work, how I communicate, and maybe even about how independent and resilient I am. But preparing for today's conversation made me wonder if I'm doing the very thing we all complain about in the workplace, reducing people to generational stereotypes. So today, I'm excited to unpack what our generations really tell us and what they don't. Many of you may have heard Megan Gerhardt before. She was a keynote speaker at the 2024 AMA Higher Ed Symposium. Megan is a professor of management and leadership at Miami University's Farmer School of Business. And she is the author of Gentelligence, a revolutionary approach to leading an intergenerational workforce. I loved this conversation with Megan, and I hope you get a lot out of it, not just about how to lead teams from diverse generations, but also how to speak to Gen Z as they are in our pipeline and Gen Alpha, which is coming up. I hope you enjoy.
Our job is to teach students how to think or think about thinking. And when has there ever been a more important time for that than now? I'm in the field of human capital and all about people and with high tech, the need for high touch human interaction and thought goes up, not down. And so I think we've never been more relevant or needed if we're willing to rise to that challenge.
You're listening to Confessions of a Higher Ed CMO with Jaime Hunt, your source for insight and inspiration on the issues shaping higher ed marketing. From AI and branding to enrollment strategy and leadership, each episode explores the ideas, challenges, and opportunities facing today's marketing leaders. Let's get into it. Hey, Megan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
I am so thrilled to have you here. I saw you to give the keynote, and I'm going to pat myself on the back a little bit because it was my idea to have you do the keynote at the American Marketing Association. I think that was in 2024. Was that the year you were there?
That's right. Yeah.
And I am embarrassed that now it's 2026 and now I'm having you on the show. But your talk was so engaging and so interesting. But I want to just start with assuming nobody saw that that's listening. For the listeners who haven't read your book or aren't familiar with the work that you do, what is Gentelligence?
Gentelligence is a term I came up with. It's been over 10 years now, but it basically means we need to get smarter about the way that we think about generational differences. I expand that to talk about age differences, experience differences, anything where, it absolutely is valid and makes sense that we have different perspectives and expertise based on the time in history that we were born and grew up and entered our careers, that we primarily see that treated in a very shallow, stereotypical, generation shaming kind of way, instead of what we know works when it comes to any kind of difference, which is, how do we see this as a source of strength and opportunity? What are the ways that we create workplaces where I can be learning from people significantly older and younger, and they can be learning from me, and it creates this amazing potential for problem solving, for innovation, but also a much more engaged workforce across all career stages, levels, generations. So it's really just turning what tends to be looked at as a frustration into an opportunity.
I'm so fascinated about the work that you do. Early in my career, when I was a reporter, 1999, I wrote a story about generational conflict in the workplace, and that was millennials weren't yet in the workplace much. It was like the younger Gen Xers, and we had all the boomers and the silent generation, the greatest generation, and all of that. And I was so fascinated by it. What made you get interested in generational differences?
My doctorate's in organizational behavior. So think, organizational psychology broadly defined. And so really interested in what really engages people to be motivated, perform well? Like, how do we create the workplaces that we're all feeling like we are valued, but also contributing and in creating value? How do you do that? And so back in, oh goodness, I want to say it was probably 2009. I had been a professor at Miami University, where I still am now, and was still on the younger end of being a faculty member. I started when I had turned 26, so I was younger, and certainly looked younger, which I miss these days, but that was then. And so it was just kind of a random knock on my door in my office. Someone from our dean's office had been contacted by a company coming to campus for a conference. They were struggling with a lot of generational conflict and were hoping that there was some expert on campus that maybe could walk them through different ways to think about that. And I knew, this much about it when I was asked, but I love a microphone. So I geared up pretty quickly and I gave what I'm sure most people associate with a generational differences workshop, right?
Mm-hmm.
The really stereotypical, like, here's the three things all Gen Xers experienced. Here's how we all act and behave, enter infographic. Like, I did just kind of like the most bare minimum thing that was available to me. And what I noticed at that talk was how negative the narrative was from all directions, that it was really unlike anything I'd ever seen. Most of the time when it comes to any kind of diversity or difference, we try, at least I'm gonna say that we try, or hope that we try to understand other points of view and why people might have different perspectives in a way that's a little more gracious, particularly in the workplace, than what I saw around generation. Like, it was kind of like the gloves were off, and we got to skip that topic when it came to like respecting difference. It was sort of like, if you don't see it the way we see it, then you're wrong,
Mm.
right? And that struck me as being so fascinating, that we didn't apply all those things we know in our field are important to leveraging difference in a way that's valuable. I mean, any kind of difference, diversity that you want to talk about, it can be race or gender or ethnicity or religion or culture or whatever it is. We know it doesn't magically create value. It only creates value if you lead and manage it in a way that allows people to feel respected and learn from each other. So that was definitely not happening when it came to generations, and then beyond that age. And I was asked, from that initial engagement, to do other engagements. It was a word of mouth, and it didn't take me very long to say, well, I don't want to be the person coming in and reinforcing stereotypes. We have to be able to do better than this. And so that really began my quest to take kind of the academic piece, like, what do we actually know that's not pop psychology and really shallow, but how do we make it interesting and engaging and relevant and harness what people are really experiencing? And so that's how I got started. I think the other piece of it is that my lived experience as a younger Gen Xer, my first students were the oldest millennials, so that's
Mm.
about when that happened, right after you had
Mm-hmm.
said you wrote that article. I was noticing differences in how they were thinking about work or education, in ways that were really interesting to me. And I just, maybe by personality, am very curious.
Yeah.
And so I thought, why are they thinking about this differently? Not what's wrong with them, right? But like, why would they look at this differently than my cohort that's only 5, 10 years older than them? Like, what has shifted that would lead to that? And really just found it fascinating to help people think about the fact that everyone in a generation is not one thing, which
Right.
is what we tend to get when it comes to generations. But generational norms are real. Like,
Mm.
norm is just a frequency. So to say more people in my generation had this experience or view work this way than my parents or my kids' generation, and here's probably why that is, that was a conversation I wasn't hearing anybody have at any kind of deep way. So my lived experience was, here I was at 26, learning from my students, asking them why they were looking at things differently than I did. And then, of course, learning from my older faculty mentors. And that was such a pivotal part of my early career, was that like multi-directional learning. And I thought, are other people not getting to do this? Like, is this not happening other places? I think in academia, we have that opportunity more readily probably than other places. But yeah, so that's kind of the journey. And I had so many positive experiences, particularly learning from my students, that I really thought were missing something here. And I wanted to bring that to the forefront.
You mentioned stereotypes, and I'm curious about what you think some of the biggest myths each generation believes about the others, because it's constant. It's an almost daily thing. I feel like I hear something about, Gen Z or millennials or boomers or fill in the I feel like they don't talk about Gen X as much as the other
No, we're
generation.
not talked about. I always say, like, I cheer for Gen X because no one else does. Like, I love all generations. I'm a champion of all generations, but like, we kind of got to cheer for ourselves.
We're the middle children.
We are. We're a very small generation, and so we get a little bit less, airtime, which is interesting. But so I think what's interesting is like stereotypes sometimes are rooted in something, right, that people are reacting to. And when we wrote Gentelligence, which is 5 years ago, last week was when the book came out. I can't believe it's been that long. But one of the things that I noted was going back as far as we could find evidence, people have had the same reaction to whoever the next generation is, right? They're creating sort of this wave, this ripple coming in with these somewhat different norms, and we don't like it, right? We don't like change. We don't, who do you think you are? Like I had to do it this way, so do you. Like all of those things sort of are sitting there, and they've always sat there. And so like we saw quotes from like, Plato or Aristotle being like, these kids these days, I don't know what's wrong with them.
I
And a
love
different version of that, every so many years. So I found that really fascinating. I think our memories are short, and there's this interesting interplay that academia struggles with, which is that life stage and generation are very intertangled, but they are somewhat different. And so young people, right, tend to have norms of being wide-eyed and energetic and idealistic and thinking they are seeing things that no one has ever seen before. That was true for all of us.
Mhm.
But then generationally, there are some very unique things that different generations have learned growing up that the generation before didn't have that experience. And so I think when it comes to stereotypes, many are rooted in whatever the latest version of, Gen Xers were called slackers,
Mhm.
because we were pushing back on the boomer norm of workaholic,
Mhm.
of 60 hours a week being something you should be willing to give your career, because we grew up with a lot of independence. That's not a stereotype, that's a statistic, right? We had
Mhm.
more dual career families, more single parent families when Gen X was growing up because of women's rights. So more of us had independence at an earlier age. We didn't necessarily have mom home supervising. We had to be a little more self-directed as a generation, not every person, right? But
Mhm.
as a generation. And so when we got to working age, a lot more Gen Xers sort of wrinkled their nose up and said, well, I'm happy to work and like have a good job, but I don't want to give my whole life. Like there's a lot of things I like to do with my free time that I got to experience earlier than people ever had. And I'm not giving all that up for a job.
Yeah.
Well, the lens on that was, okay, slackers.
Mhm.
And slacker just meant you want what we have, but you're not willing to do what we had to do to get it. Like, that's not okay. And then fast forward to the millennials, and we called them entitled, right? That's the word, the stereotype that is associated most often with millennials, unfortunately. But it means the same thing, right? You millennials, short version, were raised at a time when parenting norms were quite different than they were Gen X or anyone before. A lot of investment, the parenting norm shifted where kids were really in the center of the family. And this was just a social change where a lot of our boomers who had been very successful wanted to give their kids a jump start to that success, which is great and very valid. But that meant we were developing, educating, supporting children at a level we had never as a society seen before, right? We're doing sports and language and dance and tutors and all the things where we were really investing in kids in a main character way and telling them anything was possible for them if they worked hard. And when they got to the workplace, they wanted to start a couple steps ahead of where the previous generation did because many of them had had multiple internships or leadership positions for 10 years, and they had been told for a long time that they had this potential and they needed to fulfill it, and they were called entitled when they wanted to start a little ahead of where other people had been, and that's just another version of slacker.
Mhm.
So I think when you see a stereotype, you have to think, well, why are people saying that? What are
Mhm.
they reacting to? And of course, our Gen Zs, our youngest generation in the workplace right now, we hear things like snowflake, right? Oh, they're
Mm.
very fragile, or, trigger warning and these things. And I always like to say, well, let's take a step back. Like, where you're reacting to the fact that maybe they struggle to be self-directed or aren't resilient in the ways that you pride yourself as being at their age. Why? And they didn't raise themselves. And our Gen Zs are all the way to 29 right now, 14 to 29, 13 to 29, depending on the years you use. So they're not all children, right? We have kind of an interesting divide, but really raised at a time where we as parents, I have a Gen Z myself, we kept the bubble wrap, right? We didn't want you to fail. We don't want you to fall on your face. That would be very public. You would be behind. Then let's throw a pandemic in there, like, and
Right.
all the things going on in the world. So we'll fix it for you. Don't worry, we'll fix it.
Mhm.
They're resilient in ways I think we haven't necessarily seen yet because of what they've been through. But in other ways, we haven't really let them fall on their face. And so when we come at them with this, well, poor snowflakes need everything laid out for them, it's like, well, we did that, right? In higher ed, we've given them the rubrics and the review sheets, and we'll give you 3 times to turn in that assignment. Well, you got to kind of scaffold to the point where they're self-directed and gritty and
Mhm.
resilient. Like, that's not really what we raised them to be ready to do. So I think, going back to your question, a lot of stereotypes are rooted in sort of the experience they have and how it hits people different.
Mhm.
The one generation we haven't really talked about would be our boomers. And I think the stereotypes that we had of boomers when they were younger have evolved. Now we're hearing the okay boomer, which is usually code for resistance to change,
Mhm.
or the stereotype that boomers can't use tech, which there's no research backing that up at all. It tends to be a little bit more of a resource preservation. Like, I boomers are completely competent to use technology, but kind of are not so interested in the latest shiniest thing at the moment it drops, the way
Mhm.
that younger people tend to be. And that's tied to different kinds of intelligence. But it's like, well, let's see if we're still talking about that in a couple months, and then I'll decide whether it's worth. I've been here before, right?
Right.
I've
Right.
I've been
I
told we're doing a new thing like
right.
80 times.
I
So I'm
got the
just
laser discs. Yeah.
exactly. I'm like over here rebuying my DVDs because now it's cool. And I was
Yeah.
like, why didn't I save all my DVDs from college? Apparently, we're doing that again. So, I love digging into stereotypes because it's like, well, where is that coming
Mhm.
from? What do you mean by that? They're not always incorrect, but they're usually incomplete, is
Mhm.
probably what I would want to say about that.
It's really fascinating to me to think about all the ways that we think about work differently. And when you were talking about resilience and grit, I was thinking about a messaging project that I'm working on. And the provost was talking about how one of the elements of this institution's education is helping students build resilience. And that
Mhm.
that is something that is, from her perspective, of keen interest to parents of these students, that they're like, we want our students to build, or our children to build resilience. Does that feel accurate to you, that parents are looking for ways to countermand this snowflake idea within their children?
So, what I think is really fascinating that we get to experience in higher ed is, I remember really clearly when my students were millennials, and we heard about helicopter parenting. We saw it on campus in the form of, like, students' mom calling to say, like, my son doesn't get D's. I heard he got a D. It's like, I legally cannot talk to you about this,
Right.
right? He's an adult. Or like, Jamie can't have an 8 o'clock class. She needs her sleep, those kinds of things. But then I have a foot both in industry and academia, right? I'm sitting in this really interesting space. And so my clients at that time were the parents of millennials. And they were calling me and saying, you have to come help me figure out what to do about these kids. Like, they're calling me by my first name, or they can't, do this simple thing on their own, or whatever the criticism was. And the irony there was so thick to me. And it's like, how many times a day do you talk to your child? Right?
Right.
You're on the phone to your child 3 or 4 times a day
Mhm.
while they're on campus with us, and you can't figure out why your young 24-year-old employee, right, is lacking conviction or self-direction or whatever the complaint was. And it's like, you really can't have it both ways. So I think your question's really interesting. I think when it comes to our own kids, we of course want them to be resilient. I would love to say that my son is incredibly resilient, but when the rubber hits the road and I think, do I let him sort out that problem with his advisor on his own? Or do I ghostwrite the email, send it to him and say, send this to your advisor because this is wrong? I hate to say it, but I'm probably often doing the latter,
Yeah.
right? And so I think we would like the magic wand where we're like, yep, my kid's resilient, having, and maybe they would like the university to help do that. I could see, right? That's maybe part of what higher ed needs to step up and help do. Because I think that leads to this interesting question about like what is the relevancy of higher ed today, right? That
Mhm.
we're all hearing about. I have a lot of opinions on that, but I do think college has always been much more than what you're learning in the classroom, right? We
Mhm.
would always say it's about learning who you are and developing your own identity and finding your people and making independent decisions. And it's like an incubator. And so part of that incubator now probably does need to be a little pushback on how much help and support, unless obviously I'm all for help and support that we are required to give or believe is helpful. But I've really started thinking about, is it helpful for them to get, I don't give review sheets, I don't give study guides. I'm like, those are called your notes. I'm not
Mhm.
doing you any I know you're going to like me more, but I'm not giving you any favors because your boss isn't going to give you a review sheet for your project, right? Or just, I do think we see places like, there's a lot of consulting firms that have launched resiliency training for early career hires. And in Gentelligence, we have a version of that we're doing. It's not resiliency training, but like Gentelligence for that age group. And I think higher ed has an interesting role, right? To be able to say, well, traditionally, we've given you all the scaffolding and support, right? Gen Z was the first generation, the oldest of Gen Z was in preschool the year No Child Left Behind was passed. Like, I just submitted a paper on this. So in the US, their entire educational life, we've been legally required to understand their challenges and provide them the support they need, which
Mhm.
no argument there. But what does that mean? What's a reasonable accommodation when you go to work?
Mhm.
And I think when we talk about things like ADHD or anxiety or stress or burnout, where there's a lot of gray area about what kind of accommodation would be helpful or is reasonable, everyone's going to comply with ADA. Like, I'm not arguing with that at all. But I've had a lot of interesting conversations with therapists as well as managers around what's a reasonable accommodation for someone who gets burned out easily, right?
Mm.
That's probably not
Mhm.
a clinical diagnosis, but like, if there's been a lot of scaffolding to help that person as a student because we want them to be successful, and then they get dropped into a high pressure job. I have a colleague who said my assistant said she needed me to break her tasks down into smaller pieces for
Mhm.
her. Well, I
Mhm.
have to do that. I said, well, is that a reasonable accommodation for the role that she has? And she said, no, that's literally why I hired an assistant. I don't have time.
Mhm.
And it's like, well, I can see why the person's asking for that. That's probably been done for them by a parent or by
Mhm.
teachers, but it's not reasonable as an adult with a job. And
Mhm.
so I think, Jamie, the thing that's really interesting to me is we in higher ed maybe need to step in and say, you are absolutely allowed to advocate for yourself and take good care of yourself and protect your mental and physical health, which this generation is much better at doing than any generation before. But that might mean you can't have any job you want,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like that's an interesting space where the memo's been, kind of the holdover from millennials. You can be anything you want to be,
Mm-hmm.
which many millennials are still trying to cash that check, right?
Yep.
Millennial hustle culture, like I've been working my butt off. What happened to I can be anything I want to be? Like,
Yep.
where's the payoff? I think, particularly for our students right now, you can absolutely decide that you want less work hours or you want a less high stress job or you don't want to sacrifice your mental health for your career. Like, kudos, 100% support that. That might mean some jobs are not good jobs for you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or like if you are, you know, you do have some sort of a challenge in some way. I've had this great conversation with my son before. It's like, that might mean there's some jobs that are just not great jobs for you. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of jobs that are great jobs for you, but you can't have any job and have all of the things and support that you need, right? And I
Yeah.
think we haven't maybe done a good job connecting those dots. So I guess the last thing I would say about your question is like what I would love and what Gentelligence would suggest is I would love to dig in and say, like, when we say resiliency, what does that mean to you?
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean you can get knocked down and get back up by yourself? Does that mean, you advocate for yourself? Does that mean you realize that maybe not every job or career is going to work for you? Like
Mm-hmm.
what do we all mean by resiliency? Because I bet our students would define it differently than their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that would be a fascinating conversation.
That would be a fascinating conversation. I mean, when you were talking, I was thinking about if you faint at the sight of blood, you probably can't be a doctor. Like that's just it's just off the table for you unless you figure out a way to get around that, much like any other of the types of challenges that come with any specific career. And you touched on this a little bit earlier that higher ed has this gamut of people across all generations, from the students to employees to faculty who've been there for a long time. And I'm curious about, what when you have all of these generations working on the same team, how can you build that harmony or make sure everybody's working together the best way that they can?
Yeah, I mean that's the work that I love to do, and I think we have you know 4 practices in our book, and I won't highlight all of them, but I've really leaned in the last 5 years. Well, I've been doing I've been able to present this to companies all over the world and universities, and it really comes down to how do we create an environment where people don't see their age as a hindrance at minimum, right? Being older or being younger is not something that's going to prevent you from being hired, of course, legally speaking. But although we're not protecting younger people from age discrimination in the United States, but also learning, right? Are the learning and development opportunities concentrated towards just our early career people? Are we genuinely willing to hire people later in a career stage or
Mm-hmm.
life or age? Or are we sort of, programming our AI bots to look for certain things that mean our older people are probably not going to, I mean, are we inadvertently, having some sort of bias there? But also, how do we promote? How do we hire? How do we develop people? Um, the book I'm working on right now, so I'm in the middle of a new book, which is a follow up to Gentelligence. I talk a lot about what are the load bearing walls.
Mm-hmm.
In your organization, the load bearing walls are things that still matter today, even if we don't like them or the younger people are shaking them. Like, we got to keep this up or the whole place is falling down. And if that's the case, as older people, we have to be willing to explain and educate and
Mm-hmm.
answer questions about why we still think this way of doing things is so important.
Mm-hmm.
Because this generation grew up with unlimited access to information and explanation. So that's above your pay grade, or you just need to trust me, this is how we do it, isn't going to work. That's not
Mm-hmm.
how you build places that seem, trustworthy. So we have to be willing on that side to say like, oh, I'm so glad you're interested. The reason we have people wait 18 months before they're considered for promotion is actually because A, B, and C. If I
Mm-hmm.
know why and it's still valid and I still think it works, then I should explain it to my 23-year-old employee who really would like to be promoted very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
If I get a question and, why do we X, right? Why do I need 5 years of experience for this job level? And I can't answer it because actually there's not a good reason anymore. Like that made sense 20 years ago, but you're kind of right. It doesn't make sense anymore. I also have to be willing as a leader to say, that's actually a really good question. I'd love to talk through what alternatives would be. I can give some context and maybe that's not a wall that's serving us anymore. It's not load
Mm-hmm.
bearing. And so I think making the space where we don't change everything just because as younger people we want everything, we want to come in and change everything the way we think it makes sense. We have to be respectful of the context and the wisdom of the people who've been in that house a long time. But also, if we're never willing to revisit things, that's how we become obsolete. And we lose, which what I'm hearing across industries, young people are not afraid to jump, right? And they're jumping for valid and not valid reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of high pressure industries are losing the youngest part of their pipeline because whatever the walls are that we thought were load bearing, they're saying, then I'm not going to be a doctor. I don't want to be a lawyer. I'm not going to work in consulting. And again, as we talked about before, maybe that's great. Like they've realized those aren't trade offs they're willing to make. But for industries that are looking around and saying when the baby boomers do eventually retire, there's not enough people to fill those roles. There's not enough Gen Xers. There's a lot of millennials, but demographically, as we're seeing in higher ed, Gen Z is small, right? Similar to Gen X. And so you can't just say, well, good riddance. We're going to not hire this generation if they can't cut it. We might have to
Right.
start looking at those walls. So I think I really ask people to start replacing judgment with curiosity. And that doesn't mean we give in one way or the other, but we try to have smarter conversations about, are these things in this organization serving us? Are
Mm-hmm.
some people disproportionately affected by these processes or practices? Are we open to listening to people and ideas from anywhere? Or do we still have systems where, unless you've been here X number of years, your point of view isn't going to be taken seriously? And I think we've designed a series of power questions, which I'm happy to get into if you want, but just how do we start conversations where we show, I absolutely understand you probably see this differently than me and I'm not threatened by that, kind of fascinated by it. So let's
Mm-hmm.
at least get this all out here because that's diversity of thought, right? We know how valuable
Mm-hmm.
that is if we're willing to hear it.
I love this notion of curiosity because that's what it sounds like you're saying about, going into these conversations with, I want to hear your perspective and having that curiosity about how they got to that perspective, why they think that way. Because
Mhm.
curiosity is my favorite trait for a marketer. Like you have to be willing to listen. You have to be willing to hear and do that without defensiveness and without sort of putting up those boundaries that say, well, but my way is right. And it's just so fascinating. In my last role before I moved into consulting, I had younger baby boomers on my team all the way down to Gen Z on the team, and it was really fun to watch, in particular, the younger baby boomer working with the Gen Zer and seeing them learning from each other and seeing them being open to, well, I want to hear what you think about this because I haven't been in college for 35 years or whatever. And I loved watching that and loved watching their friendship kind of form as they were forging that. And I think that wasn't, I'm not patting myself on the back as like, as a leader, I made that happen. I think it was largely a function of they were both really curious people who were willing to learn from one another. I'm curious how a leader, if somebody listening to this podcast gets a new team with this broad swath of generations on their team, how can they foster that if it's not happening naturally?
Yeah, I love that question. I think it's rare that it happens naturally because our human tendencies, of course, are if someone seems different than me, I'm not sure if I trust that, right? It doesn't
Hmm.
matter what the difference is. And then we don't really get a lot of exposure to working in meaningful ways with people a lot older or younger.
Hmm.
Like in higher ed, I have a lot of students younger than me, but I'm teaching them
Hmm.
unless I set up an environment or an opportunity for them to sort of be on an even playing field in terms of participating. And so I do think you have to be proactive. So proactive would be the first thing I would say. Like, let's proactively build in opportunities, one, to role model. So even if you say you don't get credit, right? The fact that like something's happening there where we're encouraging and creating, even if it's a lunch and learn or
Hmm.
it's we've really been hearing some different generational perspectives on this challenge that we're trying to solve. So we just wanted to create an opportunity for everybody to openly get to bring their point of view in without judgment. Those kinds of things. Like it can even be something as small as we're going to change up the way we run our meetings.
Mm.
Because in a lot of places, the inherent way it works is like, well, I don't know if I'm allowed to talk because I
Hmm.
just got. And when certain generations do talk, right, or then that's where entitled came in. Like I'm sorry I said something because I felt like everybody thought that was a really inappropriate thing for me as a new person to speak up. I remember really clearly when I started at Miami 23 years ago, I had a senior colleague, highly respected, who came to me and a couple of my new cohort colleagues and said, this is a place where you don't need to wait to speak up. We hired you because we really value your perspective. So please say what you need to say. And I've never forgotten that. I'm sure they're
Mm.
sorry they said that right now. They're like, remember that one time when we told her to speak up? But that to me is the kind of leadership where you're creating that psychological
Hmm.
safety for younger people who maybe aren't bold enough to just give it a whirl. They've heard they might be seen as entitled. Number one thing my students ask me in coaching when they're going into an internship or new job is like, how do I add value but not be seen like I think I know everything? Because I really don't know anything. They're
Yeah.
aware, most of them. And so I think that, and then I think we can go one step further. So one of my favorite tools from our book is this concept of mutual mentoring, which you described really well with your example. And I've worked with some clients who have piloted mutual mentoring programs. So we all know reverse mentoring, we all know mentoring, and mutual mentoring is just this idea that we believe it should be normal for older people to learn from younger and younger people to learn from older, maybe about different things. But one of my clients did sort of an experiment. They invited people who were interested, they paired them up. I think it was 6 months, and they had a list of suggested topics. So they said, like, we suggest you meet at least once a month. Some of them were like career development and feedback or like advocating for your career growth. And some of them were things like, AI or getting your clients list to grow or things that were very specific to their industry. And the only rules were like you meet, everybody has full permission to share, be curious. And they invited me to their final meeting. It was like a breakfast. And I just said, I'd love to hear, like, what'd you learn? Like, what would you do different? And in, I think, 5 out of the 6 pairs, they said, we were surprised we had so much in common.
Mm. Interesting.
Yeah, I love that. And in I think those 5 out of the 6 pairs, they said we didn't expect to become friends.
Interesting.
And I feel that way. Like I try to be aware that, I often have students that I work with in different capacities at the university that are my students, but pretty soon they're colleagues, right? They're not
Hmm.
students any longer. And like I feel that way. I learn from my students every week, if not every day. And I think it can be something formal like, hey, we're going to pilot this mutual mentoring program. Who's interested? Or it can be as simple as like if it's just your team, I am genuinely, like you, curious, and I will say, whether it's in a classroom or in a meeting, like, can we pause? Like, I would like to hear how you're looking at this because
Mm.
I feel pretty sure it's probably not exactly how I'm looking at it. Like, how
Mhm.
one of my power questions that I use with Gentelligence is, how would you approach this?
Mhm.
So, like an example, obviously, we're all trying to navigate the wild, wild west of AI. And in higher ed, it's like, like building the plane as we're flying it. It's like, well, I know you need to know how to use this ethically. I'm also, trying not to fall into existential depression that my entire world has been turned upside down and all the things I've developed to help you learn this are something you can put into a bot
Mhm.
now. So hold on while I figure that out. But since Chat GPT came on the scene, I've started every semester asking my students, like, tell me how this is helping you learn.
Mhm.
Like, what are you doing with it that you think is awesome?
Mhm.
Where has it been a problem?
Mhm.
What do you want me to know about it? And then I do the same thing. And what I found, whether it's in that environment or any of my clients, is when an older person takes the lead and models, I am genuinely interested in what you're seeing that I
Mhm.
don't see. All these things happen. One, it's showing respect to a group that might not expect to get it from someone older. It's showing me where their heads are at.
Mhm.
So even if all their responses are completely wild and I think, "Oh my gosh, this is I know that now." Because if I
Mhm.
think we're really close to seeing things the same way and then I find out that they're all the way over here, that's a totally different challenge for me to deal with. So that's helpful. And then most of the time, you learn something really valuable. Like when my students say, I try to do these assignments on my own, and then I'll ask AI to tell me where I didn't meet the criteria for the assignment or to stress test my argument, or is there bias in what I'm saying? And I'm thinking, I love all that. Why wouldn't I want? They didn't do that before. Now they're doing it. Like,
Right.
great. And then, I can say, well, let me tell you what I love to use it for, or where I found it's a problem, or let me share the story about a consulting firm who got sued for $250 million because some junior person didn't check their sources. They trusted AI. Like, we can have this great conversation. But what happens in the middle of all of that is the vulnerability that comes with asking,
Mm.
right? And of course, we know Brene Brown would say like vulnerability is a really powerful leadership tool. Is my respect that I get from them doesn't come from them thinking I know everything. They already know I don't know everything. That is not a well kept, secret. And so by saying, things I don't know, I don't worry that that means they're going to respect me less. I think that's normally the fear is if I ask a younger person, they're going to think that I don't know anything. It's like, no, they already think you don't know anything or they're not sure you do. But I will tell you, if you ask for their opinion first, they are a million times more willing to listen to yours. And that's where the teaching and the mentoring from our end comes in. And in my favorite course evaluation comment I've ever gotten is a student said, she really enjoys learning along with us.
Oh, that's really
And
sweet.
I'm like, okay, I'll take that all day long. So I,
Yeah.
I think just creating those cultures where it's not unusual that an idea might come from a younger person, or we still make space in a meeting, like we set up meetings where, hey, we're going to go around, everyone's going to get a few minutes to share their initial point of view. So we're not fighting for airtime across age or tenure.
Mhm.
I think those are just really easy kind of structural ways or the mutual mentoring to make space for that.
I love what you said about giving space in a discussion for everybody to have a voice because I feel like that kind of helps deal with that one person's dominating the conversation. People just assume that's the one way that's right or that that's the direction we're going to go. I think for leaders listening, one of the things that I always liked to do was I would say my thoughts last. because I didn't want people to say, oh, well, that's what Jamie said, so that's what she wants to hear. So, kind of going so that you're not setting the table with a preconceived idea. And I feel like that allows people to actually feel like they can open up and share their genuine thought without being colored by what you say. I think it's really important for leaders to understand the weight of the things that we say. And I can remember really learning that lesson when somebody came back and like the whole team's anxious because you said X or Y. And I was like, that was just a passing comment. Like, that's not something you all needed to worry about. But people look to the leaders and try to take their direction from the leaders in the nonverbals, in the ideas that you throw out. And so it's just a good practice, I think, even if you're not working across generational differences, to understand that and understand the sway that what you say has. I think especially as a faculty member, like that's you're there to teach them. Um, I want to pivot just a little bit and talk about how communications differences come into play with the generational differences. So, marketers are often marketing to Gen Z. They have millennial and Gen X parents. I can't believe that I am of an age where I have friends with kids graduating from college. They might have boomer alumni and donors, faculty across all generations. How can they create messaging or reach those audiences without just being completely generic?
I think that's such an interesting conversation because I think there's two things to think about. One is we have some really important common ground across generations, and it's hard to remember that when we're sucked into like infographics and like cookie cutter stereotypes. So, research shows that across generation, everyone cares about respect. I mean, these might have slightly different names depending on the research, but respect, like we want to be respected,
Mm-hmm.
connection, no generational differences. Everyone wants to feel connected to others. And the third one is autonomy or agency. Like I have choice, I have control. So often when we see research saying generational differences are minimal or they're not real, what they're pointing at is a lot of the research that's continually shown, I don't find generational differences in that.
Mm.
If we stop there, we miss a huge part of the conversation that's relevant to your question, which is those are needs, right? Those are needs we all have that are relatively universal to humans. What's different across generations is the norms we've learned on how do you fill that need.
Mm-hmm.
So if we think about the norm or the need for being respected, if you started your career when you were, as a boomer, the way you earned respect was you put your head down, closed your mouth, did your job, and somebody would come promote you. That worked. That was a norm that worked. It was functional. Fast forward to a millennial or a Gen Z, they need respect. But what they have learned growing up when they did is if you want it, you better get yourself in the front of the line and put your hand up for that opportunity, or somebody else is going to take it first. Like
Mm.
you sit in the back and wait. And probably no better, example of this for your question is connection.
Mm-hmm.
We all want to be connected, but how does my 20-year-old feel connection compared to how I do it? And that's why I say, get off your phone. You're driving me crazy. Like, who are you talking to? Like, what do you mean you have a friend in wherever? You've never been there. You don't, like my sort of outdated, judgy way of looking at what it means to connect. So I think for communication purposes, thinking about, well, the common thread here is we want to connect our stakeholders to our mission or to our message. Everybody wants to feel connected, but it might be that requires different channeling, slightly different messaging depending on the group. Like our incoming students are going to define connection differently than alums. Or like when you think about donors who are of a generation where there's almost like a norm that you are obligated to give back to
Mm-hmm.
your alma mater or that norm has shifted, right? And so maybe our younger alums aren't going to respond to that messaging. They want to feel connected to their alma mater. They want to feel respected by their alma mater, but might require something different for them to feel like that's been fulfilled. So I don't think you want to go generic, but I think you also want to be careful not to assume the same message will or won't resonate across generations. And of course, this gets into your area more than mine around like focus groups. But one of my favorite examples you might remember from AMA was, something as simple as how different generations read text messages, right? The
Mhm.
famous period example that's making the rounds again this week. That Gen Z sees a period as harsh, and people my age and older just see it as being professional and punctuating. And so it's really like this era's version of like, don't go to a different country and use language without shopping it around and making sure that it tracks correctly in that culture, right? Don't know your audience. And so I think as long as you stay true to your message, right? We're talking about connection, or we're talking about what makes us unique. Where you can get a little bit more custom is saying, well, we're going to reach this audience in this way, but we need to reach this, whether it's channel
Mhm.
or, you know, Gen Z or Gen Alpha is maybe going to want the 30-second reel,
Mhm.
whereas, the boomers are going to want the letter or the brochure with the color thing, and they're not going to want the QR code, right? Like as a norm, not by the person. And so I think that's okay. I think that's where we think about, let's see if this message resonates. Yes, everyone loves it, but maybe the channel is different, or the way that we're going to get it out there, the length of the message or the format we tweak. But balancing this idea of common needs but different norms, I think could be really helpful there.
For those who didn't see Megan speak at AMA, she was talking about how Gen Z sees periods. I think you might have used the word scary, because I'm looking back at my text messages. So it's in your session, and I texted two Miami students, actually Amataj Carr and Dawson Cosgrove, and I asked them, and Amataj said it is in fact scary, and I was like, I'm very sorry for terrifying you, and she said, with adults, it's slightly known they don't mean it like that. I
Mhm.
was like, great. I hope you'll visit me in the old folks' home that obviously need to check into.
Well, and I think the reason it's been such a sticky example, Jamie, is it's a small thing that you can scroll your phone and you can't then unsee it. And it's kind of a tip of the iceberg, right? So like and then I did a follow-up around like a lot of younger people getting feedback from bosses that they need to like roll it back on the emojis and the LOLs and the ha ha ha's. And I was thinking, I'm always like, well, why are they doing that? Like they're smart people. They want to be perceived as professional. So where is this coming from? And I learned really interesting that it's a way to soften a message, because growing up in the age of group texting and cancel culture, they are very concerned they're going to be interpreted wrong, or someone's going to take offense, which you can understand how that would very much be top of mind growing up in the last 20 years. So they're kind of, I say overcorrecting, but even that has judgment in it, right? It's like, well, I'm
Yeah.
just going to throw a ha 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 so Megan doesn't take this wrong.
Mhm.
And then what happens is I might see that and think, well, that's not very professional. Like, well, this isn't even a funny topic. Why
Yeah.
are you sending me the laughing, crying emoji? It's exactly the same, right? They think, why is she ending that sentence with a period? Is she mad at me? Like she's being very formal about something that's not formal. And I have my content creator, Hannah, is I think 25, 26. And sorry, Hannah, I can't remember how old you are, but she's a Gen Z, fantastic. And like, I will sometimes text her. I try to be mindful of the periods now because I don't want to frighten her. But the other day I did an undo send. So it
Mhm.
said like Megan
Oh,
unsent a message,
yeah.
and she texted me. She's like, "What was that? Like, I am freaking out." And I was like, "Oh, I sent something to you. I meant to send to my dad. Like not like a not something we need to read into. Like that was a
Right.
my bad. But like that alone was like invoking fear in her that something had happened that I decided not to tell her, or whatever it is. And so like I love that example because it's a gateway to so many more conversations about what are we seeing differently. And it's not right or wrong. Like I still throw a period when I'm texting sometimes. Um, but just that awareness, right? Like
Mhm.
I want to be aware that you are seeing this in a totally different way than I am. And I'm not going to go to snowflakes, can't believe they are scared of a period. I want to go to the camp of like, well, that's fascinating.
Right.
Like, all right, like let's unpack that. Like it's a form of emotional intelligence, right? Because
Yeah.
to them there's learning needed. Like let's talk about our audience.
Mhm.
If you want to be respected, which I know you do because that's a shared need, if you're texting somebody that's my age or older, the emojis and the ha ha ha's might read a
Mhm.
little more unprofessional than you would like. Just
Mhm.
letting you know, make your own choices. The
Yeah.
same way I'd say to somebody my age, the period has a lot more gravity and harshness to a certain age demographic. So just keep that in mind. Do what you want to do. I'm not telling anybody what to do, but it's kind of like walking into a foreign country and not being aware that it's rude in that country to blank. Like you can make your own choices, but there are consequences to those choices in all directions. And so I think communication is the best one to talk about because it's just pervasive, right? It's
Mhm.
everywhere. That's why I love those examples so much.
Yeah, it was fascinating, that discussion. I think we did a phone call catch up a couple weeks after that and talked about it a little bit more. And it's so interesting to think about just how the era that you're raised in and like what the norms were at that time and the experiences that we largely had can have such a difference in how you do so many different things. So Megan, I always wrap up my call by asking, what is your higher ed hottest take? I feel like as a
Mm.
tenured professor, you cannot disappoint me. I need to know what your hottest higher ed take is.
Yes. All right. My hot take. I just finished up a draft of an article I'm writing for Harvard Business Review for their higher ed division. So I'll give you a version of that hot take because hopefully it'll come out similar time to this. Is I have noted a paradox, which is that many of us in higher ed are kind of in a period of mourning around AI and the fact that it's sort of tilted our world upside down, even more so than many worlds. I have friends who are, depressed and upset and
Mm,
angry and all of the things. And a lot of conversations I hear are how do we stop the students from using this? How do we shut this down? And those are the wrong conversations
mhm,
because, all of my industry clients and all of my student experience with interviewing and jobs are saying, I'm expected day one to show up and know how to use this well, more so even than older people, because they expect me as a digital native tech savvy Gen Z to lead the way on this. And I'm learning it at the same time everybody else is.
mhm.
But then they're coming out of an environment where, some percentage of their faculty is telling them it's cheating and it's forbidden.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is a defense mechanism. Like if I just say you are not ever allowed, and if I catch you, which is not realistic, you can't enforce that, then I'm not preparing those students for the world they're going to face. And it is a little different by industry, but I think it's safe to say just about everybody's going to need to be able to use this as a tool. And so my hot take is that we for a long time in higher ed have said our job is to teach students how to think or think about thinking. And when has there ever been a more important time for that than now? I'm in the field of human capital and all about people and with high tech, the need for high touch human interaction and thought goes up, not down. And so I think we've never been more relevant or needed if we're willing to rise to that challenge. And we don't have to have it all figured out. As I said before, like I'm working with my students to figure out what that looks like semester by semester. But I do think we have a responsibility to have those conversations about how do we want to use this? What's our class syllabus? But then what's your personal syllabus? Like I won't
Mhm.
use it for certain for writing, right? Because my voice is unique to me. And I've tried to do that before and thought, well, I hate that. That doesn't sound like I wrote it. So now I try not to do that, but I will use it for brainstorming or for, certain things. And what does that look like for them? And then what's your organization's syllabus, right? What's your company's syllabus going to be on that? And like, my hot take is, I think we're more versus less relevant. And you and I talked about resiliency, right? If that's the need, our job is to step up and say, how do we help them get from where they are to where they need to be, whether it's AI or resiliency or anything else? And we don't really have time for like wringing our hands and being sad about it. Like it's time to step up and do what we uniquely are able to do. So that's my hot take.
I love it. I love that it's an actual hot take. And not, sometimes I feel like people feel like, well, I don't want to get fired, so I'm not going to give you my hottest take when they're not tenured faculty. Megan, where can people find you if they want to learn more about your work?
So all my Gentelligence work you can find at gentelligence.org. So that has my blog and my book and, way to contact me there. LinkedIn, like to post all kinds of things there. So those are probably the two best places to find me.
Awesome. Well, track down Megan because she shares some great insights that I think would be helpful for anybody who's trying to communicate with people who are in a different generation and any leader. Listeners, as always, you can find me on LinkedIn at Jaime Hunt, Jaime, and I am a child of the 70s, so I am named after the Bionic Woman. And you can also find me on my website at solvehighered.com, and you can find my book at heartoverhype.com. And listeners, it's always a pleasure. Let's go bust some silos. Listeners, can I ask you a quick favor? If you enjoy this show, take a moment to give it a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I'm a type A eldest daughter, so positive feedback is basically my love language. I also genuinely love hearing from listeners. You can find me at LinkedIn at Jaime Hunt. That's JaimeHunt. And yes, I am named after the Bionic Woman. You can also find me at solvehighered.com. Say hello, share a thought, pitch an idea. Don't be shy. I genuinely love hearing from you.